What does it mean to make space in our approach to theology and ministry for signs, wonders, hearing God, praying for the sick, all of that supernatural stuff? Well, it means addressing the worldview that we have, the process by which a worldview is formed, and then beginning to take practical steps to make space for a different worldview. So in this video, we're going to look at how worldviews are formed and how you can begin to practically make space for signs, wonders, even the supernatural. That is coming up. Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the Multiplying Disciples channel. My name is Mark. It's great to be with you, where we give you simple tools, principles, strategies for multiplying disciples, leaders, and churches until there's no people and no place left that has not been engaged with the gospel. So in these recent videos, we've been unpacking this topic of signs and wonders. And I want to jump into a topic on worldview. And worldview is critical to this process because the basic assumptions or presuppositions we have about how the world works and what reality is are going to determine a lot of things. So when I say worldview, it's going to determine the way in which we theologize and we participate in a lot of things in our life, but especially in the context of what we're talking about here, signs and wonders and that kind of ministry. Whether we even entertain it or make space for it, it's going to come down to our worldview. So first of all, what is worldview? So a worldview is a set of presuppositions or assumptions that we hold consciously or unconsciously about the basic makeup of the world that we live in. So let me say that again. A worldview, it's a set of presuppositions, a set of assumptions that you probably have, and often in the West, a lot of those are unconscious, but they might be conscious, and they make up the basic way that we think about and approach living in the world. Okay, so to become involved in signs and wonders in the West, it's to make a paradigm shift in our worldview, because we live in a culture where that is not a normal part of our assumptions about the way the world works. So to begin to make space for it in the West, we're going to have to go through a paradigm shift. Now that's becoming less and less true, and that's shifting a lot in recent years. This used to be very true, that you have to make a paradigm shift. More and more people are making space for that on their worldview and teaching others that kind of thought, but there's still a lot of us that have got to make that paradigm shift. So what's a biblical example of worldview and how there's a need for a shift of worldview? Well, what we're taught, first of all, I'll say this, what we're taught shapes our worldview. We see clashing worldviews when we see different responses to events formed through different teaching, because we're taught something about why the world is the way it is and how to interpret the events around us. All of that is taught to us, or it's caught. It's a part of how we grow up in the world. We just begin to catch these basic assumptions about why the world is the way it is. And that just emerges, and we can see that in the way that people of different worldviews respond to an event. Now, here's a great example from the book of Acts. So in Acts 14, verses 8 through 18, Paul and Barnabas, the team comes to Lystra. And as they're in Lystra on Paul's first missionary journey, they arrive there and they see a lame man healed as they pray. And God does this. That would be part of my worldview, our worldview. And so the people that saw this, that was not their worldview. They had a basic assumption that led them to a conclusion, which for them was what reality was. So what was that basic assumption? Their basic assumption was only gods can do healing like this. And so they turned to Barnabas and Paul, Saul, and they said, hey man, these guys must be gods. We should exalt them. Now, they quickly were like, no. They came against this, and they were trying to stop this immediately because their worldview was not at all that, right? Paul and Barnabas had the worldview that Jesus is the all-powerful God. And that these men were commissioned to carry out this commission of taking the gospel to the nations and pray for the sick and proclaim the good news. So worldview is a starting point but ensures a certain conclusion that comes out of it, because it becomes a lens, if you will. So another metaphor that we could use is it's like a pair of glasses that we wear that shape the way we see the world and we respond to the world. So in this case, two totally different responses to the same event happening. This man becomes healed by the power of God, and they, because of the lens that they're wearing, they respond by trying to make Barnabas and Saul Paul gods. Not true, right? And so that's an example of that. Now, we've got to begin to confront some of the way that our Western assumptions and worldview as Christians have tried to cope with the experience and the naturalism, the rationalism that we're born into. So one such theologian who's done this is John MacArthur, and I'm not picking on him. There's a lot of people out there who hold to similar views, and there are many of them. I don't know all of them, but many of them, and I would affirm John is trying to follow Jesus the best that he can. And so I'm not picking on him, but he has a view of dispensationalism, it's called. And so this theological view has the idea that signs and wonders have ceased with the completion of the preaching of the gospel message in the early years of the church. So, in other words, miracles, signs, healing, deliverance, that stuff is no longer needed because it was needed to get the kingdom to new people and new places, and that's done. So that's their assumption, and their conclusion is formed right out of that. You can see how that works. And so that assumption for them is based on experience. So we are born into a culture that has some assumptions and makes those assumptions based on the way things have been taught to us and the way things have worked within that culture, and then a conclusion is formed out of that. So let me give you some examples of this, of how worldviews tend to lead us to a conclusion and lead us to interpret the world around us. So it's not just John MacArthur. We all do this, right? So let's look at some examples from just the world around us. So here's some examples. So clothing, for example, it's immodest to go without clothes in the U.S., and so the conclusion we have, you must wear clothes, even to bed, because it's immodest. But there's another whole continent, the continent of Africa, that we'll look at here with this. One covers one's body only if you're hiding something. These are the people, the Gaba people in Nigeria. So their conclusion is you've got to go naked to prove yourself. The assumption around clothing is totally different. You've got to go naked to prove yourself. Okay, so let's look at another cultural feature of the culture that we're born into. So buying and selling. So the assumption in the U.S. that this is an impersonal exchange. It's an economic transaction. So our conclusion then is that prices should be fixed. No interest in the seller as a person. They're just there to serve me as I'm getting the product I want. Let's get it over quickly. It's kind of the way that leads to. Whereas, again, in Africa, also in Asia, Latin America, this is a social person-to-person interaction. It's about that person in front of you. So you're going to negotiate the price. You're going to establish a personal relationship. You're going to take time talking with them. So those are some examples of how that assumption formed by worldview of a cultural feature that's true for different cultures leads to different conclusions, right? So let's look at a couple more. Youthfulness in the U.S., very desirable, obviously, right? It's all over all the magazines, all of the TV shows. And so this leads to the conclusion that you've got to look young, act young, use cosmetics, whatever it takes to maintain your youth. Whereas in other places, like, again, the continent of Africa, it's tolerated. It's to be overcome. In other words, the conclusion is you've got to prove yourself to be mature. The older that you are, the more authority you have within the culture. So youthfulness, and of course the West is invading different places and exporting our worldview, so that's affecting how this plays out. But on the whole, it's a culture in which the older people are valued and considered mature and have the voice. Okay, so let's look at one or two more. Family. So family, for example, down on this list in the U.S. is centered around romantic relationships, right? So compatibility as spouses is all important. Now, the world view of the U.S. around romantic love has been exported all over the world at this point. And it's largely, a lot of people have got this kind of romantic, non-biblical view of relationships and family. Whereas there are still parts of Africa where family exists for the children, and the outcome being that it's about a mother-child relationship that is paramount, and everything else is kind of built around that. Okay, so we'll look at one more. So a cultural feature is rapid change. In the US, progress. We call that a good thing. And so the conclusion is we've got to encourage rapid change and innovation because that results in progress, and that's a good thing. Now, the West has tried to export our worldview and approach to the world to everybody else again, but not everybody agrees with that. There are places, again, like Africa, where that feels like a threat to our security and our tradition. And so the conclusion from that threat is that conservatism is valued. And so the goal is, and the aim is stability. What has been, we want to continue. So that's a totally different approach to the idea of change is coming. Okay, so the next question is it possible to change a worldview? It is, and that is what's called a paradigm shift. In other words, the information or what's happening in front of us doesn't change. The event doesn't change, the information doesn't change, but how we interpret it and what we assume and presume about it changes. We have a paradigm shift. So an example of a paradigm shift is this classic example of the old and the young woman. So when you look at this picture, the question is, what age is this woman? And some people will say they see an old woman, some a young woman. And the process is this invitation to a paradigm shift. The lines of the drawing don't shift, but a shift in perception happens. So as we look again, we see, as this is highlighted a different way on your screen if you're watching a video, that you can see a young woman if you look at a certain part of it in a certain way, and an old woman if you look at it in a different way. And again, the lines are still the same. What's presented, the information or the thing that's happening in front of us, the event, is the same, but how we interpret it changes completely, and we have a paradigm shift. In fact, my mind begins to kind of go back and forth between the two. I can see both at the same time. So a paradigm shift begins to happen. It's a shift in perception of the observer. That's what's shifting here. Not the information, but a shift in perception of the observer. Now, if we're going to approach talking about signs and wonders, we've got to talk about what has been called the excluded middle by a guy named John Wimber, who has been real helpful in bringing this paradigm to the West in the last 30, 40 years. Now, I'm drawing heavily from his content and his material in these videos, and especially in this one, I'm drawing a lot from his content. So I want to talk about this idea of the excluded middle. And in our worldview as Westerners, we're open to what's called the transcendent world, or that which is beyond us. We call it religion, right? Faith, or the sacred. There might be a miracle or two that we'd be open to. And so there's hell, there's heaven, eternity. And so there's sometimes in the African context a high god. There's Vishnu in the Hindu worldview or religion. There's this idea of these cosmic forces, karma. And, sometimes this is there's these agents within this spiritual transcendent world of angels, of demons, of spirits, of other worlds, right? And then in the West, especially, we've got this empirical world of our senses. What can we touch? And we're real focused on this. And it's about the sight and the experience of the natural order. It's secular, and it's about this worldly problems, about what's right in front of us, right? And so there's explanations based on empirical observations, I think is a real helpful aspect of this. And so one person might shoot an arrow into a deer, as the example here, and he attributes death to the arrow. That is what caused this deer to die. It was the arrow that caused it. We see that right in front of us. So that's what our empirical data shows us. So somebody cooks a meal, and they attribute the cooked meal to the fire under the pot. So cause and effect, right? There's theories about the natural world, about how to build a house, about how to plant crops, about how to sail a canoe or a sailboat. Theories about human relationships emerge as well. How to raise children, how to treat spouses, all of that based on empirical data. So we've got these two different aspects, but what Wimber highlights is that there's an excluded middle. And we begin to exclude some of the dynamics, the forces that are on this earth in between these other two. And so we can exclude, or we can be hesitant to talk about supernatural forces, planetary influences, or demons, or angels, witchcraft, all of these kinds of things. And it makes us uncomfortable to even approach these things. And I'm not saying all these things are theologically true, or of course they're not, but even to begin to be open to these ideas, it doesn't fit into our worldview as Westerners. Now, just to give just a brief aside, and this is very brief, we could go into a lot more here, but one of the points that Wimber makes is the source of this is a Platonic dualism that its origins in the 17th and 18th centuries emerged. And so as people began to look for an understanding in the natural and materialistic naturalism in the world around us, and looking more and more to the empirical world of our senses, there was an embracing of Platonic dualism. It's either explainable this way or this way, and it began to exclude this middle that we're looking at here. And so part of that is just that we're all born into this in the West, and in order to make space for the idea of signs and wonders, we've got to make space for a paradigm shift and make space for that excluded middle. Now, what does that actually mean to begin to make space for this? And again, we're moving just at a high level today. I'm not trying to get into all these details, but kind of set this up for you to even make you aware that if you live in the West and you've grown up underneath this kind of worldview, this may be with just a natural assumptions that are unconscious to you. Again, a worldview can be an unconscious assumption about reality that you've never even examined. So beginning to even examine, is that my worldview, is a step. What are some other ways you can begin to shift your paradigm? So first of all, like I just said, investigate alternative worldviews. Make yourself even aware that you've got a worldview and that there might be other ones. And so we want to shift to the kingdom or biblical worldview that we see in the New Testament, and not just relegate that to an Eastern, unevolved or not progressed way of thinking. That is a prideful Western outcome of the worldview we've been saturated in. Instead, let's read and reread the New Testament to allow the words of Scripture to begin to shape our worldview, right? So begin to read kingdom theology books. I pointed you to The Gospel of the Kingdom by George Ladd. There's other books on kingdom theology that can begin to help us to make space for this. Expose yourself to stories from churches outside of the West. There are churches all around the world, and increasingly among those in the West, that have made space for this in their worldview, have made space in their practice, beginning to put into practice what they see in the New Testament, and they're seeing signs, wonders, hearing God, deliverance, healing happen as they step out to pray. So make space for that by exposing yourself to those streams in the body of Christ, or listening. And I'm not saying you have to agree with them. I'm just saying go get around them. And so you can join a training, something that we do, where we train people in some practical things they can do to be more effective in praying for the sick and hearing God's voice and casting out demons and these kinds of things. So join a training and get exposed to this. Number 2, find a church whose worldview accepts the excluded middle. And again, you don't have to theologically agree with everything that they're doing, but you can go and you can just observe what's happening, and that can begin to help you to wrestle through what you see in the New Testament, and what do you think about that, and should you pursue that in your practice? And then finally, start where you are. So maybe you do these 1 and 2, and you also do 3, or maybe you just start where you are now and you start to pray for the sick, and do your best to put into practice what you see in the pages of Scripture and let God unfold it. So I would encourage you to, if you want to shift your paradigm, these are some simple ways to begin to move towards that. And 1 Corinthians 14 exhorts us to eagerly desire these spiritual gifts. They're not just for some, or you're just born with it. We can actually grow into being more and more capable and aware, and flowing is a word I sometimes will use, in the spiritual gifts. And you can do that by beginning to make space in your paradigm, space in your practice, and going after it. So I hope that's helpful for you guys, and we'll continue talking about it. See you guys next time.